Hello, Brobs. I'm back with Napoleon's Bisexual Emperor by Major General Frank Richardson, MD. I don't know where I left off. When Napoleon found that Loget had relapsed and finally renounced their friendship, Loget showed an unpleasant side to his nature, trying to set his friends against Napoleon and finally being so unwise as to jostle Bonaparte from behind, for which he was roughly handled, fell against the stove, and got badly hurt. Investigation of this incident was halted by Napoleon's cold statement that he had been insulted and had revenged himself. De Bellicourt emigrated in 1791, and it is not known if he ever returned to France. De Mazis, who was also emigrated after the Revolution, did return to France after a spell in the Portuguese army and was welcomed and befriended by Napoleon in exceptionally generous style. William Hazlitt, who admired Napoleon and wrote a biography of him only 7 years after his death, thought that at school the want to proper exercise, together with the not giving way to the gaiety and flow of animal spirits natural at his time of life, probably stunted his growth. We may not agree with this, but it is a refreshingly English viewpoint to wonder if a good game of football might not have made a better man of him. Hey, play some football, Bonaparte, and then you won't want men's rumps. What the fuck is this? Alright. Oh man, I don't know if I can continue. This book should be chopped in half right here. Play a little football. Give them lots of exercise was for the long traditional prescription of schoolmasters for the prevention of suppression of manifestations of the normal homosexual phase in boys. Merevsky believed that Napoleon's unsociableness was his safeguard from these temptations, but it seems evident from Dr. Bartel's more penetrating analysis that young Bonaparte faced up to the problem and rejected any kind of physical expression of adolescent homosexuality. Indeed, it would be surprising to learn that he had become involved in the prevalent homosexual behavior. Most of his biographers stress his sullen isolation at school and his contempt for his comrades, and there is some evidence that in early life he disliked being touched. His schoolfellows were well aware of his feelings about them and actually accepted them, subjected him to a cadet's court-martial, which decided that Napoleon was unfit to be a cadet captain or to lead his comrades because he despised them and disdained their affections. As a mature man, Napoleon plainly understood about the homosexual phase in a boy's life, but it seems likely that any such feelings of which he may have been aware would have disturbed him, and that they were repressed and sublimated in his intense application to study. His homosexuality was probably latent, as it is in so many boys and young men, and his denunciations of the homosexual conduct of others could have stemmed from the frustration of repressing similar tendencies to himself. A close friend of Napoleon's youth, when he was a lieutenant, was Joseph Siraci, a Corsican sculptor who had lived in Rome since his childhood. He was about 9 years older than Napoleon, and their friendship is described by Hilaire Belloc as follows. These two were bound by a certain friendship, certainly by intimacy. They called each other by the two, which is as though in English one word, the Christian name. He was an artist with much of the virtue, all the vices which attach to men of his kind. Later, when Napoleon was a general, Siraci tried to renew the old companionship, and he did so again later with the first consul in Paris. But Napoleon was irritated by the deliberate carelessness and public intimacy of his approach. Tudiant and all, and public intimacy of his approach. And tutoyant and all, and repelled his friendship, though In St. Helena, he claimed that it was Sirachi who had turned against him because he had become a tyrant. Sirachi was executed in 1802, having been involved in one of the plots against Napoleon's life, not a very well organized one for Count Riel. The prefect of police described it as a thoroughly French secret, for the whole of Paris was in the know. Hilaire Belloc seems to have been hinting that the relationship of Napoleon with Sirachi was a homosexual one. His friendship with Duroc was quite possibly, and that with Gourgaud undeniably of that nature. As for Alexander I, the suggestion may seem bizarre, but is not entirely groundless. From his school days until his marriage, Napoleon lived in almost exclusively male society, and all his life, not only when he was in the field with the soldiers. It's shocking that he lived in male life since he was. He surrounded himself with the handsome young men as aides-de-camp, valets, pages, and so on. Now, there need be nothing remarkable about that, any more than there is about the employment in all armies of young soldiers, you think, as batmen or officers' orderlies. Field Marshal Montgomery exerted his personal influence upon his battles by living at his tactical headquarters far from his senior staff officers who did the spade work, and surrounded by young liaison officers, his eyes and ears, who roamed the battlefield in their jeeps, just as did Wellington's or Napoleon's aides-de-camp on their horses. This is how many young officers have learned their profession, and so it was with Napoleon's aides. Many of them, not much younger than Napoleon himself, Montes, LOs, learned a lot about the personalities of the generals to whom they conveyed their chief's intentions, or from whom they learned what he wanted to know, but they did not expect to be suddenly promoted to take these generals' places. This, as we have seen, happened to Duroc, and he was not the only one. Caulaincourt's advancement was principally in the field of diplomacy, but he was a general of division at the age of 32. Even more remarkable was the case of another young aide-de-camp, Anne Jean-Marie René Savary, later Duke of Rovigo, who was 5 years younger than Napoleon. His memoirs begin with the sentence, "I have been accused of being fanatically devoted to the emperor, and of being so still." The truth of the accusation is fully borne out by the memoirs and by his history. Savary was chiefly employed in doing Napoleon's dirty work. He was the kind of unprincipled ruffian which dictators find essential. It was he who liquidated conspirators like Pichegru and Cadoodle, and the unlucky English sailor Captain Wright, who used to land such conspirators in France and had the misfortune to be shipwrecked and captured. The Duke of Enghien was another of the usurper's victims, disposed of by Savary. When Marshal Lannes fell sick, Savary was given command of his 5th Corps at the age of 32, to the intense annoyance of Suchet, who thought only 4 years older than Savary was very much senior to him in the army. It is hard to believe that there was no gossip about the favoritism and inordinately rapid promotion which the emperor bestowed upon one effeminate young man, the Chevalier de Sainte-Croix, who became his protege. Constant wrote this about him. "This tale about Monsieur de Sainte-Croix reminds me how fond the emperor was of him. In the army his advancement was both brilliant and rapid. For enlisting at the age of 22, he was already a general of division. When he was killed in Spain, I often saw him at the emperor's headquarters, a slightly built, dapper little fellow, with a pretty smooth face, more like a girl's than a brave soldier," which he certainly was. His features were so delicate, his cheeks so pink, his fair hair so curly, that when the emperor was in a good humor, he always called him Miss Sainte-Croix. Sanqua made a bad start with the emperor, one of whose cousins he had fatally wounded in a duel. Baron Marbo explained that this was not the only cause of the emperor's initial dislike of this young officer. The emperor had another reason for this unfriendly welcome. Although of short stature himself, Napoleon had a great preference for tall, strong, masculine men. But Sainte Croix was small, slight, and with the face of a pretty fair complexioned woman. But Marbeau, a far better judge of military matters than Constant, was lavish in his praise of the soldierly qualities and military efficiency of Sainte Croix, which he says soon won the emperor's esteem, so that a close friendship rapidly matured. He soon became a colonel, and after the Battle of Aspern-Essling used to report to the emperor every morning, when the aides-de-camp had ordered to bring him at once to the emperor's bedroom, and the emperor, dressing in his presence, would discuss the position of the two armies. This was the period when, after his defeat by Archduke Charles, Napoleon had withdrawn his army to the island of Lobau and Danube. The outposts of the two armies were in full view of one another, and in order to make daylight reconnaissances, Napoleon, dressed in a sergeant's overcoat, would go to the river accompanied by Sainte Croix, who would strip and enter the water to give the impression of a harmless bathing party. Sainte Croix met his end in front of Wellington's lines of Torres Vedras, where his head was taken off by a shot from a gunboat on the Tagus. His headless body galloped on for some distance. That's pretty incredible. Good looks were not always enough to secure Napoleon's favor. What did he get hit with? From a gunboat? Okay. Good looks were not always enough to secure Napoleon's favor. One of the most handsome of the aides-de-camp was Jacques Alexander Bernard Law Lauriston. Bernard Law, Field Marshal Montgomery's Christian names, were not enough to make a Marshal of Lauriston until 1823, after Napoleon's death. Both the Law and the Lauriston point to his Scottish descent. He was the son of a general who was descended from the Edinburgh family. I've already forgot the pronunciation. Edinburgh family, the Laws of Lauriston. He was a year older than Napoleon, whose friend he had been since school days in Paris. He became his aide-de-camp in 1800. Napoleon habitually referred to him as Mon bel aide-de-camp, perhaps a little sardonically for Mademoiselle Avrillon. Josephine's lady's maid said that he never really liked Lauriston. Sick. She could only suggest that the coldness between them was due to a presentiment. Perhaps his Scots ancestry steeled him against the Corsican caresses. Napoleon embraced his soldiers at the slightest pretext, and when inspecting troops he had a habit of grasping a button on the tunic of the man to whom he was speaking. He frequently picked up young boys for this sort of special attention. Passing down the ranks one day, his attention became riveted upon a 16-year-old peasant boy from Saxony, whose button he grasped during a conversation, which seemed endless to the victim. Sometimes Napoleon grasped not a button or an ear, but at the soldier's nose, which may be quite significant. It is said that the nose has some special significance for homosexuals. The rubbing of noses is common in some races in which homosexual practices are not invested with the same social stigma or taboo as they are among Europeans. In an article entitled "The Factual Study of Homosexuality" in the British Medical Journal in 1958, the case is recorded of a known homosexual who was attracted by boys' noses. They were sexual objects, and if he grasped a boy's nose, he had an orgasm. This guy's got some powers. He grabbed the boy's nose and just jizzed everywhere. What the fuck? The German psychologist Kraft, Ebing, Hirschfeld, Bloch, and Steckel law firm all recognized the nose as an occasional object of sexual attraction, a form of sexual symbolism or fetishism. But of course, Napoleon's soldiers had not heard about all this. If he pleased the little corporal to hold on to their noses, They were gratified to be noticed, and it cannot have been so painful as all that air and hair pulling. Napoleon's encounters with boy soldiers sometimes had rather ridiculous results, for he was known to give rapid promotion, even an immediate commission, to some youth who had attracted his attention. Madame Junot told of a conversation between a drummer boy of 16 or 17 and Napoleon, who promptly made him a subaltern in the Consular Guard. It is not recorded what his veterans thought about this, but one can imagine some pretty earthy comments in the ranks. The emperor could not be with his soldiers all the time. In his palaces he had pages, valets, ushers, footmen, and Mamelukes. Mademoiselle Avrillon, writing about Napoleon's predilection for handsome men, said that most of his pages had first been in the service of her mistress, Josephine. Napoleon, she explained, particularly liked good-looking youths, so when any of Josephine's pages attracted him by their faces or demeanor, he would take them into his own service. She added that he hated to see men's faces when he came to Josephine's apartment. Napoleon's pages normally joined his establishment at the age of 14 or 16, and were pages up to the age of 18. A very young exception was Louis Houtre, taken on as a page in Elba when he was 8. What? He later wrote that Napoleon used to pinch my cheek. He made faces at me and gave me sweets. Napoleon was always attended by one or more pages, all very handsome boys, especially the older ones, according to a contemporary observer quoted by Baron Imbert de Saint-Amand. As we have seen, he could not keep his hands off people, and the pages shared the pinches and slaps. Sometimes they were far from friendly slaps, and one boy was so severely slapped simply for bringing a letter containing bad news that he had to be restrained by the others and later by his father from making a fuss about it. The emperor's patronage extended to many boys whom he did not take into his personal service. Inspecting the cadets of the Lycée Impérial in 1808, he was struck by the diminutive A. Chailly, aged 8, in his miniature uniform. Many of the other cadets had their hair pulled, but young Chailly was gently drawn forward by the arm, pinched, and given a soufflet de caresse. He plucked up courage to complain that his father only gave him 3 sous for pocket money, and Napoleon, probably recalling his own letter to his father on the same subject, made the child a royal bursar and saw to it that he got proper pocket money. Some of Napoleon's valets have already been mentioned. The best known and on the evidence of his memoirs, the most intelligent was Louis Constant Very, always known as Constant. He served Napoleon faithfully from 1800 to 1814. He was one of those who served a brief apprenticeship with Josephine, which in his case was only a few months. He described how, when he was 21, the first consul noticed him during dinner and, having stared at him for a long time and looked him over from head to foot, asked if he would like to accompany him on a campaign. Constant was always eager to justify his desertion of the emperor. Perhaps he had simply had enough. During his 15 years, he only had 2 holidays, each about a week, and the second of these was sick leave. Constant's place was taken on June 1814 by Marchand, Mademoiselle Marchand, as Napoleon called him, in a good mood. He had been one of the 12 young men chosen as ushers in 1811 when he was 19. At Napoleon's famous Mameluke, Rustam, he had deserted at the same time as Constant. The young Frenchman, Etienne Saint-Denis, became the only Mameluke. He had entered Napoleon's service in 1806 at the age of 18 and had been appointed second Mameluke 5 years later. He had a lively sense of the rights of his position and does not seem to have seen anything ridiculous in being renamed Ali and made to dress in Oriental clothes. This rather absurd manifestation of Napoleon's love of Orientalism had at first an underlying political motive. The Mamelukes, who included a troop of Mameluke cavalry, were intended to be visible evidence that the Egyptian campaign had not been a complete failure. They can be compared to the Gurkha orderly officers added by Queen Victoria to the Buckingham Palace scene, But when the great queen inaugurated this pleasing custom, she could really claim to be the Empress of India. Napoleon had abandoned his hopes of eastern conquests, together with the remains of his unhappy army of Egypt. To the French, Rustam became a romantically interesting figure about Napoleon's return to France. He was part of the exciting Egyptian influence which set its mark on so many facets of the cultural revival of the early days of the consulate and empire. Furniture and buildings were embellished with sphinxes. Beautiful striped fabrics reflected the supposed influence of Egypt. And fashions included headdresses a la Mameluke. A favorite color was Puel de Mameluke, like our former N-word brown, now named Good Earth in the interest of race relations. The consulate also had its Terror d'Egypte. Rustam Raza was a young Georgian of good family who had been kidnapped and carried off to Cairo at the age of 6 or 7 years. He joined Napoleon's entourage in Egypt as a handsome youth of 17, and thenceforward until his desertion in 1814 was never far from his master's side. He was in attendance at every official occasion and slept outside Napoleon's bedroom door, thus being privy to most of his affairs. He said that he was pinched or handled in some way daily from the very start. And he was sometimes seen in tears after a particularly vigorous ear pulling. The soldiers in Egypt had misgivings about the precise duties of this youth. Georgians were very suspect in those days because they provided many prostitutes of both sexes. Hector Fleischmann, in his book about Rustam, wrote that it was at this time that the French royalists began to accuse the usurper of sodomy, and they claimed that these allegations were confirmed by the soldiers of the army of Egypt. The soldiers freely admitted that conditions in Egypt had led to the spread within the French army of the unnatural practices of the country, and Napoleon had only himself to blame for his name being associated with such scandals. His attitude towards the victim of the Arabs, described in Note 4, Chapter 1, indicated a curious attitude to such conduct, and he was known to have said that sodomy was the vice of great men of old, and to have expressed the opinion that Julius Caesar was justified in engaging in homosexual practices dressed as a woman at the court of the king of Bithynia, presumably in furtherance of his diplomatic mission. Napoleon always held that the end justified the means, but surely this was going a bit too far. Little wonder then that the gossip grew and ran through the army of Egypt, that their young general himself was addicted to Socratic habits, the polite expression which even private soldiers in those days used in their letters and memoirs. Presumably, blunter words were used around the campfires. This scandal was avidly seized upon by the scurrilous English pamphleteer Louis Goldsmith, who wrote that Napoleon united two tastes rarely encountered in one man, being dissolute with women and addicted to a vice of which Socrates was falsely accused. He added, I should not wonder if he should, like his prototype Nero, marry a boy. Lest it be thought that I am a modern Louis Goldsmith, let me repeat that I do not believe that Napoleon resorted to such practices. However, it certainly does appear that it was not only the physical and mental deterioration of the last few years of his life, or the dull and unnatural existence in St. Helena, which brought out the latent homosexuality in his character. Mademoiselle Marchand had his predecessor in Mademoiselle Sanquoise, Gourgon his in Dorac, and perhaps even in the Tsar. Mr. Cronin writes, Napoleon was never accused of homosexual relations, save perhaps in the English press. Indeed, he disliked homosexuality. It would be more accurate to say that it was only by such writers as Goldsmith or by French royalists that he was accused of sodomy, which is rather different. It must be clearly understood that many homosexual men engage in no sort of physical manifestations of their deviation, for which indeed they may feel revulsion. The fact that Napoleon at school shunned all physical contacts with homosexual boys is just what one would expect from all we know of his character. By the time of his Egyptian campaign, he had become more broad minded or cynical about such practices. The really significant fact is that Mr. Cronin is able to tell us quite a lot about Napoleon's attitude to homosexuality. Of what other great men until quite recent times could it be said that we know so much? Some of his contemporaries, from generals to ladies' maids, have been able to tell us what were Napoleon's ideas of masculine attractiveness. He himself spoke of masculine and feminine types of men among his own friends. Mr. Cronin himself tells us that Napoleon found that his friendships with men often began with physical attraction, and this took a curious form. Here he is referring to Napoleon's confessions to Caulaincourt, in which I have referred before that he felt nothing in the heart, everything in the loins, and in another place which I shall leave nameless. Napoleon himself plainly recognized the existence of the normal homosexual phase in a boy's development, for he wrote about one of his brothers, then a boy of 13. He loves his friend as he will love his mistress at 20. Egoism is of later birth. At 40, a man loves his fortune, and at 80, himself. This rather cynical summary of male psychology gives us an insight into Napoleon's own mind. In his own case, egoism did not long wait its birth. That intense preoccupation with his own life story, seen by Jacques Bainville as the mainspring of his life, could be called narcissism. As for his love of the great fortune which he amassed, it would be unfair to call him miserly, but he had a share of his mother's parsimony and shrewdness in more money matters. Napoleon probably also had some knowledge about what we now call intersex types. For he once wrote a story about a mysterious hermaphrodite being an androgyny sybil, which, according to the Russian writer Merezhkovsky, who studied and sometimes diagnosis, what? Oh. According to the writer Merezhkovsky, who studied Napoleon's literary works, recalled sometimes Napoleon himself and sometimes Dionysus, the changeling. I don't know what the fuck this means. Napoleon probably also had some knowledge about what we now call intersex types, for he once wrote a story about a mysterious hermaphrodite being, oh, I see, an androgynous sybil, which, according to the Russian writer Merezhkovsky, who studied Napoleon's works, recalled sometimes Napoleon himself and sometimes Dionysus the changeling. It still doesn't make sense. Dionysus is an alternative name for Bacchus, in whose processions men dressed as women took part. Every man's classical dictionary says this of Dionysus: the form of his body is that of a man, but approaches the female by its softness and roundness. This is a good description of Napoleon's body, and it is at least possible that he himself in mind when he wrote this story, as he so clearly had when, during his courtship of Desiree Clary, he wrote and dedicated to her his novel in which the young hero preferred soldiering to women. Dr. Pretorius points out that Napoleon refused to allow penal legislation against homosexuality, and that he was remarkably tolerant of his chancellor, Cambyses, whom he knew to be homosexual. In his understanding of such problems, he was undoubtedly well ahead of his time, and those who seek to reform the laws in relation to homosexuality and prostitution have observed with approval that countries which were influenced by the Code Napoleon have inherited from its founder a broad-minded and humane attitude, but this, of course, tells us nothing about his own sexual orientation. Just as you have not, sir. Having now briefly surveyed Napoleon's life story, concentrating on certain aspects with a bearing on this subject, an attempt can be made to suggest where he should be placed in the spectrum of sexual adaptation. Cradle of the King of Rome and His Majesty, the King of Rome as a child. Look at that little guy. It's a great hairdo. You got to give him that much. The birth of the King of Rome. That's a fucking brilliant hairdo. What's this? General Gaspard Gougard. Man, how can you expect a guy wearing that neck? Let me wear this little fashionable thing, bruv. General Gougard de Rock, Duke of Friuli. Alright, well, there's chapter 8. Dune. Goodbye, bruv.
Goodbye.